Hello, Sam here. I'm going to give a quick recap of some ideas from Unit 6 on policy and equity, and then I'll give a quick preview of Unit 7, our final main content unit of the class, and then we just have a short conclusion unit at the very end. But looking back at Unit 6, you had a lot of really great discussion about policy issues, equity issues. We really appreciate that you got into those ideas. You shared lots of good experiences and perspectives from your own situations. We really appreciated that. One of the readings was about data-based decision-making, and you brought some really good critical lenses to that article. You brought up some skepticism about using year-to-year data because there's a lot of complexity from year to year. There's lots of context, other things going on, and so it's kind of dangerous to just boil things down to a specific number and then almost put too much stock in that perhaps. The data can be useful, but it has to be understood in the proper context, so we thought you made a lot of good points about that. You also expressed some concern, we think fairly so, about using student test scores and data to evaluate teachers or to evaluate school districts. And you brought up good concerns. There's a lot of important concerns. I'm going to put a link to an article that I think summarizes some of the concerns, but just real quickly, I mean, one concern is that student test scores are based on an assessment instrument that's designed to measure student knowledge. It's not designed to measure teaching quality. So to just take one and then apply it to the other is not really appropriate in terms of using the instruments. So that's a critique from the measurement community. Another critique is that the student test scores end up kind of being more a score of like the life situation of the students rather than a score of their actual mathematics learning. And a lot of you brought up things like this where if you're in certain situations, you're probably going to have gangbusters test scores. That doesn't necessarily mean you're a good or a bad teacher, and other teachers in more challenging situations might not have great student test scores, but it's not because they're a good or bad teacher, it's more about the situation. So that's a big concern. And then another concern is that if you base teacher quality and evaluation on the student test scores, you're then basing that teacher evaluation on the narrow range of things that are picked up by those standardized tests. Standardized tests tend to measure things that are easier to measure. Memorization, kind of fact-based knowledge, kind of low-level thinking, and then kind of procedural skill. Those are easiest to measure in a standardized way, so they get overrepresented on these assessments, which then means you would kind of be evaluating teachers more on their success with low-level kinds of things, but we care about a lot more than that. We care about high-level thinking, we care about conceptual understanding, mathematical practices, and then also lots of other things like promoting creativity and empowering students and making them, feel engaged and passionate. So there's this whole range of things that are important and that are part of what a teacher does, but they are not represented in the student standardized test scores. So that's a big concern as well. So a lot of stuff there. We also had a discussion about some of the equity issues with standardized tests, and Thora brought up some good points, as did others, but Thora talked about who benefits from the testing, a question that you were discussing, and Thora said, quote, "A particular type of learner benefits from testing. This is a learner who seems to grasp quickly what is going to be on the test, and someone who seems to naturally do well on tests. Often this type of learner is able to grasp and regurgitate the material to be tested and retains it long enough to show they know it on the test. I think that a learner with a quick and facile memory benefits from the testing environment," end quote. So that's from Thora, and I would agree. There's this huge range of students. There's lots of ways of participating and engaging in mathematical thinking, but this overemphasis on standardized tests really seems to benefit those that are good memorizers, that are kind of quick and comfortable to just repeat it on a test. And that's not everybody. That's kind of a select group of students that are kind of empowered or, lifted up by this testing environment. But other students have lots of other capabilities that we shouldn't be kind of marginalizing like this. And some of you actually went so far as to say maybe nobody really benefits from the situation because the testing culture actually changes the whole dynamic of the school year and of the classroom. And so maybe there's not really anybody that benefits to their highest potential. Maybe even the kids who are good test takers would be better to be pushed in other directions rather than just towards the test. And then some of you brought up the other countries that have very high educational results, but they only take a handful of tests K-12, like 3 or 4 tests over the whole school career, and that they still have good high educational achievement. So you're sort of thinking maybe this testing is not helping anybody in kind of the general sense. And then a lot of you talked about the stereotype threat. This was an idea that resonated with people about students from different groups, and it doesn't really matter if they have high mathematical ability, medium, low. The fact that they're in a group that is perceived as being poor mathematically can actually bring anxiety and poor test performance, because they're afraid that they're going to confirm the stereotype. So for example, if there's a Latina student that feels like, oh, Latinas are not thought of as being strong mathematically, I'm about to take this high stakes test, I'm afraid that I'm going to confirm that stereotype. If I do poorly, it's going to just be more fodder for people to think that Latinas aren't as good as mathematics, for example. And this anxiety actually affects lots of people in that subgroup, not just the ones who have poor mathematical knowledge or things to grow on. It actually can affect even the high achievers, because even the high achievers know there's like a little bit of a risk that they're confirming the stereotype that's out there. And that's been shown empirically to actually make a difference on these test performances. So that resonated with a lot of you. And the thing is, in the research on stereotype threat, they've actually found that it kind of disappears if students don't care about the subject at all. Like if they are just sort of like, I am not a math person, I don't care at all about mathematics, they kind of like separate themselves from a math identity, then the stereotype threat is diminished. But I think you would agree with me that that is not a great situation. We don't want to have the stereotype threat lowering student test scores artificially. We also don't want to have students rejecting math as a way to avoid the stereotype threat. We would rather have people be empowered and feel like they're part of the mathematics community and they can be successful. That's what we actually want. And in these discussions about equity, a lot of you also shared personal stories about how the testing affects you or your students. And I would encourage you to share those stories widely with friends, family, people in the community, so that they get a sense of, on the ground with real people, how this kind of over-testing really affects things in a lot of ways. So I encourage you to do that. And Christy, I think, had a nice way of summing this up where it says, Christy said, ideally as teachers, you want to prepare students for life, not just for tests. So that's a nice way to sum it up. All right, so looking ahead to Unit 7, it's going to be a pretty straightforward unit. You have an option of 2 different readings about teacher moves. So one is a little bit more elementary focused. You could pick that one, or you could pick the one that's more secondary focused. Both articles, though, are about teacher moves that you can make, because we're going to be talking about using discourse and teacher moves eliciting students' ideas as a way of assessing, like verbal assessment by getting students to talk. That's one of the things that came up from your personal reflections last time. And then you have one of those readings. Then there is a personal reflection about those teacher moves. There's another reading that's of continuing some of these equity concerns and continuing something from earlier about tracking. Tracking is a big issue in math education. It's not necessarily the best, so we need to kind of look at that critically. So there's an article about tracking and race, and then there is a discussion about that article as well. That's by Faulkner et al. And then the only other thing for the unit is there is an assignment where we're going to ask you to think about the questions that you ask and how you elicit verbal assessment information from your students. So there's details in the assignment. If you do not have students or a class currently, there are some videos that you can watch and you will analyze the questions and the verbal assessment that's going on in a couple of videos. So that's going to be the unit. There's Thanksgiving break for a full week. So on the calendar, this unit's going to actually take 3 weeks, but it'll be 2 weeks of active working time. Hopefully you can get the discussion started a little bit before Thanksgiving break. Have a great Thanksgiving. And then after this unit's done, we just have a quick wrap-up that we will do at the end of the semester. So all right, I'll see you online.